In the early hours of the 13th of June 1944, barely a week after the Normandy landings, a small, stubby-winged aircraft crossed the English coast, making a noise, as one witness put it, rather like a Model T Ford and apparently on fire. It was flying very low and very fast, north towards London. A few minutes later, it crashed here in Bethnal Green in London, destroying this railway bridge and killing 6 people. The rescue workers, who were very quickly on the scene, searched the debris for the aircrew, but they searched in vain. They found none, there were none.
It was in fact a flying bomb, the first of Hitler's revenge weapons to fall on this country. They were designed by German scientists to terrorize Britain into submission. The other terror weapon, the V2, was a powerful and highly sophisticated rocket. It's a measure of Germany's achievement, but as little as 10 years earlier, the whole idea would have seemed fantastic. Rocketry was little more than a joke. Early enthusiasts were strapping them onto just about anything that would move. But some of the experiments began to show promise, and it was perhaps not surprising that the activities of these pioneer scientists attracted attention elsewhere. The German military saw the rocket as a means of avoiding the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, which had severely limited rearmament in Germany after the First World War. The rising fascist movement began to encourage such ventures as this so-called mail rocket. When the Nazis eventually seized power in 1933, rocket research received official blessing. The army built a secret research centre at Peenemunde, on an island close to the Baltic coast. It was commanded by an army scientist, Walter Dernberger, and it took on a promising young rocket enthusiast, Werner von Braun. Under their leadership, the Peenemunde scientists began to develop a huge new rocket which could carry over 2,000 pounds of explosive warhead. The engine, fueled with alcohol and liquid oxygen, was an early success, but von Braun had enormous problems developing a reliable guidance system. On takeoff, the rocket was travelling so slowly that the slightest breeze could deflect it from its course. To overcome this, von Braun eventually fitted a gyroscopic guidance system in the nose of the rocket, linked to steering vanes mounted in the jet exhaust. The gyroscopes automatically sensed and corrected any deflection of the rocket to maintain it on course. The vanes were of graphite in order to withstand the intense heat of the rocket exhaust. But by the early years of the war, the rocket had still not flown successfully, and the research was proving immensely costly. Many billions of Reichsmarks had been pumped into Peenemunde with very little of military value to show for it. Opposition to the rocket began to increase. Hitler himself had never been very enthusiastic and ordered a cutback. But Dernberger and von Braun had a friend at court in the shape of the Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer. He quietly and persistently argued the case.
We had no bombers which could reach England with a heavy load, and there was something which was not, there was no defense against it. And if we would have succeeded to bring maybe a few hundreds a day to London for a while, then it would have been a great shock for England, and it would have been a great relief for the German people who suffered under the bomber attacks of the Harris bombers.
By 1942, the towns of Germany were increasingly under attack by Air Marshal Harris's heavy bombers. In April, the beautiful medieval city of Lübeck was laid waste. Hitler, in his fury, demanded revenge. Weapons of terror were to be developed as a reprisal against Britain. Scientists began working on the flying bomb. The rocket also was to be developed as a powerful long-range weapon. But with failure after failure, Hitler's doubts remained. It wasn't until October 1942 that the scientists had their first success.
I knew Werner von Braun quite a long time when he invited me to see the first start of the V2 in Peenemunde, which they thought already it will be a successful one after many tests which didn't succeed. And we were coming there on the field, and this V2 was standing alone, and already vapors were coming out of the bottom. Suddenly there was a huge noise and a tremendous shivering of the soil. I must say it was one of the biggest impressions I had in my whole life. Then this huge missile was against all rules of gravity, lifting slowly, and then faster and faster, and with this thunder was disappearing in the clouds.
Two months later, just before Christmas 1942, Hitler signed the order for the mass production of the rocket. But it was premature. There were more failures. In one case, much to the surprise of the neighbouring Luftwaffe air base. Because of Peenemunde's extreme isolation, it had been possible to maintain the cloak of intense secrecy over the big rocket's development, despite a continuing series of disasters. But as well as Germans, there was also forced labour working on the site, and eventually some of them from Luxembourg managed to smuggle out information. Meanwhile, London was blissfully ignorant of the revenge being planned for it. In the spring of 1943, British intelligence was hardly aware of the rocket's existence. Chief of Scientific Air Intelligence at the time was Dr. R.V.Joned.
Well, there'd been little information before 1939 that the Germans might be developing long-range rockets. And then we heard nothing more until December 1942, when a new agent, who turned out to be a Danish chemical engineer, told us he'd overheard a conversation in Berlin between two engineers who said that there was a new weapon being developed and being tried up on the Baltic coast with a danger area, I think, of 5 kilometers square. Obviously a rather fantastic story, with a range roughly of 200 kilometers. That was the very first thing, and, well, we just began to wonder.
The turning point came when a German general, Ritter von Thoma, was captured in the Western Desert and brought to London for interrogation. A General Kruvel had also been captured, and after interrogation, the two officers were allowed to talk alone together. They did not suspect that the room was bugged, and von Thoma became careless.
The really crucial point in the story was when General von Thoma said something like, well, you know, something must have gone wrong with those rockets because, well, I saw them 18 months ago with Field Marshal von Brauchitsch. And the major in charge said they'd only be another few months before they were ready. And, well, we're somewhere near London and we've heard no bang, so nothing could have happened. Well, at that point, my deputy, Charles Frank, who I remember it was Saturday afternoon, he was just sitting opposite me, just as you are here, you see, and he suddenly looked up from reading the interrogation report and said, look, we better take those rockets seriously. And from that point onwards, the whole temper of the story changed.
The first change was the appointment of Duncan as chairman of the committee set up to investigate the evidence.
They asked me if I would take responsibility for finding out whether such a weapon existed, and if so, to advise what action should be taken to deal with it.
One of his first actions was to order a massive photo reconnaissance of enemy territory, particularly of the Baltic coast. The high-flying mosquitoes flew sortie after sortie, and eventually, on the 12th of June 1943, they brought back a photograph on which Dr. Jones believed he could see something significant.
There, on that particular picture, I saw what seemed to me to be the outline of a rocket, somewhere around 38 to 39 feet long, tail fins perhaps 10 feet long and perhaps 10 feet across at the rear end there. And immediately I saw this. I took it across to Lord Cherwell to show him that this seemed to be a rocket.
Lord Cherwell, Professor Lindemann, the chief scientific advisor to Churchill, was still not convinced, despite the photographs. Duncan Sands, however, was.
I advised the War Cabinet that, in my opinion, the Germans were developing a long-range rocket. But that opinion was not readily accepted. In particular, Churchill's principal scientific advisor, Professor Lindemann, argued strongly that any such rocket would have to be propelled by cordite, and that cordite would have to be burnt in a thick steel case, which would mean that the rocket would weigh somewhere between 60 and 100 tons, and that wasn't a feasible proposition.
Well, the complication, of course, was that Lord Cherwell didn't like Duncan Sands, and once Duncan Sands had begun to believe the evidence and say that it was a very serious danger, Cherwell reacted the other way and started to argue that there was no such thing as a rocket.
Not being a scientist myself, I refused to be drawn into a scientific argument. I took the very simple view that the fact that perhaps Professor Lindemann didn't know how to make a long-range rocket didn't necessarily mean that the Germans didn't know how to do so.
On the 23rd of June 1943, another photograph was brought back, which on the face of it looked even more convincing.
Even so, Professor Lindemann refused to be convinced and argued that these were, in fact, barrage balloons. We, however, pointed out that they were being carried on 30-ton trailers, which seemed unlikely if they were lighter than air.
On the basis of the evidence, Duncan Sands decided to advise that Peenemunde be bombed immediately. But it was over 600 miles away across occupied Europe, and with the long summer evenings and the watchful German fighter defences, the risks of heavy losses were enormous.
The destruction of Peenemunde would have to be completed in a single night. And that in turn meant that we would have to commit to the raid the greater part of the whole of our bomber force, which we might lose in a single night. It was therefore, as you can imagine, a highly dangerous and difficult decision for the War Cabinet and the Chiefs of Staff to take.
The Cabinet met in the war rooms beneath Whitehall on the 29th of June 1943, and on this occasion, Churchill asked Dr. Jones to attend.
Well, it was one of those night meetings. It started at 10 o'clock at night, and most of us came in and seated ourselves, and then Winston himself came in, and the meeting opened with Winston asking Duncan Sands to review the evidence for the rocket and the prospective countermeasures. And Duncan Sands, having reviewed the evidence, I thought a little strongly, but nevertheless essentially correctly, then advocated that the Peenemunde should be bombed. At that point, Winston turned to Lord Cherwell, sitting over here, and asked him what he thought.
Lord Cherwell argued that the whole thing was a hoax. The white shapes on the photographs were either torpedoes or dummies designed to conceal a more likely threat, such as a pilotless aircraft. When he'd finished, Churchill turned to Jones and asked him what he thought.
And I proceeded to demolish, I had to demolish Lindemann's case, you see. Well, could it be could it be a torpedo? Well, it was 40-odd feet long. It would weigh, according to the expert estimates, 40 tons. There was no German aircraft that could pick it up. The case, I told him, was stronger, I thought, than when I'd gone to him in 1940 with the beams, you see. And he said at that point, stop. He turned to Lindemann and said, hear that? That's a weighty point against you. He says the case is stronger than the beams. He said, what have you got to say to that? He said, remember, it was you who introduced him to me. And this went on right the way through. If it was a hoax, what was the result of the hoax going to be? We would bomb Peenemunde, which was one of the main German Air Force experimental establishments, you see, and a German army establishment as well. And every point that I made, there was this comedy that went on. And in the end, of course, Charles' case was substantially demolished. And various people got into various degrees of excitement. Herbert Morrison, to judge the reliability of the case, wanted for some crazy reason to know whether our evidence had come from officers or from NCOs. I mean, incredible things. Stafford Cripps was all for bombing Peenemunde at once. This was not possible because the range to Peenemunde is such that you've got to fly the last part of the trip in daylight, you see, which would be very dangerous. And so it was finally agreed we would bomb Peenemunde at the earliest possible opportunity when the nights were long enough for our aircraft just to get there and back without having to travel by daylight.
So, despite the intelligence debate over the precise role of Peenemunde, the planning of a raid went on. It was helped by the fact that only a few weeks before, the RAF had started to use window, the code name for the strips of aluminium foil that were dropped by the bombing fleets and which had successfully blinded the German radar screens. So, on the late evening of the 17th of August, a small force of mosquitoes set out for Berlin. Using the metal foil, they hoped to deceive the Germans into thinking that that was the main target for the night. At about the same time, 600 heavy bombers taxied out for takeoff. Their target, Peenemunde. If the deception worked, the German night fighters would soon be chasing the mosquitoes to Berlin, leaving the bombers unmolested. At the Luftwaffe headquarters, the deception was having effect. As the mosquitoes flew slowly across Germany, dropping the bundles of aluminium foil, General Kamhuber and his staff in fighter control saw all the signs of a massive fleet of bombers heading for the German capital. The night fighters were ordered to take off and intercept. With the fighters out of the way, the heavy bombers flew over Denmark and droned steadily on down the Baltic coast. Peenemunde lay ahead, unprotected and unaware. And the first target was not to be the test sites. Approaching from the north, at about 8,000 feet for greater accuracy, the first wave of bombers were to ignore the launching pads, fly over the development laboratories and the factory. They were to drop their first bombs on the homes of the scientists. The laboratories and the factory were the secondary targets. Shortly before midnight, the bombers could be heard approaching Peenemunde. And as the Pathfinder aircraft dropped the first marker flares, the anti-aircraft defences opened up. At first there were no night fighters. The deception had worked. But the raid took longer than had been planned, and the final wave of bombers were attacked and suffered heavy losses.
We didn't get away by any means unscathed. I think 41 aircraft were lost by the time the end of the raid, but most of them in that final raid. But had it not been for window, our losses, of course, would have been 3-4 times that.
The daylight photographs revealed that most of the targets had been hit, including the scientists' living quarters, although not by the first wave of bombers. The marker flares had been dropped in the wrong place, right over the Trassenheide concentration camp.
The whole attack was of the order of 2 miles overshot, and unfortunately in that very position was the hutted camp in which all the conscripted men from the occupied countries were, including our Luxembourgers and others who warned us about Peenemunde, and of course they suffered very heavily indeed, and we never had another report out of Peenemunde from them. It was an absolute tragedy that, no one's to blame. It's one of those tragedies of war that happened, but One should recognise the great contribution those Luxembourgers made.
Partly because of the loss of those agents, there were still great gaps in British intelligence. No one was quite sure what it was at Peenemunde that had been bombed. Back in London, in an attempt to find out, a committee was set up under the chairmanship of Sir Stafford Cripps. One of the experts involved was Wing Commander Kendall.
And we took down all the evidence we had of Peenemunde and the rockets, the V2, as it was then called. And there was very little evidence, in fact, on the V weapons from any other source. Now it happened that the day before we just got some photographs of the Pas-de-Calais area in France, which didn't correspond with anything we'd ever seen before. The sites were rather notable for the fact they had 3 ski-shaped buildings. In fact, they became known as ski sites. We found that each had a ramp under construction which was pointing towards London, and a small hangar which was also pointing towards London, where obviously whatever the weapon was assembled. Now when you've got a ramp, you can't have a rocket, because a rocket has to be fired straight into the air. Anything that goes up a ramp obviously has to have wings so that it has lift at the end of the ramp. So we concluded that we were faced by another weapon with a wingspan of less than 20 feet, because that was the size of the door of this little square hangar. And we then went to our aircraft section headed by Babs and said, we're now looking for something with a wingspan of this dimension.
Babs was Constance Babington Smith. One of her jobs was to analyse and interpret the aerial photographs of Peenemunde.
And at this point I was briefed to look for a very small aircraft. It had to have a wingspan of under 20 feet, which means, well, this is too small to carry a pilot. This means it would be a pilotless aircraft. And I did find, in the first place, a very small aircraft with this span close to the airfield, but not actually on the field. And I found it at a place where I was really trespassing on the preserves of another section at Peenemunde. We each had our own area we had to watch. And this encouraged me to go further afield still. Peenemunde, you know, is on the coast, and they were extending the airfield. There was a road going down to the shore. So I followed this road. When you're looking through a stagecoach, you really feel you are on the ground, and I followed this road down to the edge of the area. And there were 3 structures of a kind that I'd never seen before. And it seemed to me they were the sort of structure you would need if you were going to launch an aircraft or something else out to sea.
But there the trail ran cold, until at the end of November 1943, after weeks of bad weather over Europe, the pilot of a Mosquito returned with more revealing photographs of Peenemunde.
And as he got to the end of his run, the very last of these prints, there wasn't a stereo page, the last one, just reached the coast and just showed, here's the coastline. Now this is the dredging equipment, that's all part of the reclamation. But here are the 3 structures which had puzzled me so much. And you see from the shadow that they're at an angle, you can tell they're sloping. And on the central one here, this tiny little smudge linked up with the small aircraft I'd already seen, and measuring it with my measuring magnifier, I could tell that the span was just 20 feet. In other words, this was the evidence we had been waiting for. Here was the midget aircraft on a ramp, a launching ramp. It was known to us then as the Peenemunde 20. Later, of course, it was known to a great many more people as the V1.
Advanced prototypes of the V1 were by this time being tested by the Luftwaffe. This flying bomb was initially catapulted up a ramp, as this captured German training film shows.
Biegt sich dann nach oben und wird hinter dem Kolben durch Dampfdruck von unten gegen den Schlitz gepresst. In Sekundenschnelle rast das Flugzeug über die Gleitbahn und erhebt sich in die Luft.
Like the V2 rocket, its warhead consisted of a ton of explosives, but it was far simpler in design. It was powered by a ramjet engine burning ordinary low-grade petrol. Across the engine air intake was an array of small flaps. Air was forced through these flaps by the forward speed of the machine. The fuel was injected and the mixture ignited by a simple spark plug. The expanding gases temporarily closed the flaps and drove the pilotless plane forward. The flaps then opened up again and the whole cycle was repeated.
Teillast.
It sounded not unlike a car engine with a fractured silencer.
Volllast. Die Zeit läuft ab. Achtung! Abschuss.
The catapult was used to get the device up to a speed where the ramjet could take over. Having identified the weapon, the problem for scientific intelligence was to find out what it could do and how to stop it. It was being test-fired out over the Baltic, and because of its range, the Germans had developed highly sophisticated tracking techniques, something which Dr. Jones had anticipated.
It occurred to me, if they got a long-range missile, they might well try and follow it by radar. And if so, where would they go for the radar? Well, fortunately, we knew enough about the German air organization to know that the two best plotting companies for radar were in the Air Signals Experimental Regiment. It was the 14th Company and the 15th Company. And so I asked everyone to follow those two companies just as hard as they could.
Sure enough, the radar plotting companies were found to have moved to the Baltic. What's more, they reported their observations by coded radio signals. British intelligence managed to intercept the transmissions and break the code.
Money for jam, as it turned out. It was a very simple code, and it didn't take very long to put the whole thing together. And these were plots on this body that was being fired from Peenemunde. And since the stations were warned in advance when it was coming and what the aiming point was, we were able to build up the complete tracks of the bomb right up to its fall. From the tracks, you could find such a simple thing as how many they could fire in a day in trials. That gave you a minimum rate at which they could fire against us. But also particularly the speed and the height and all those details, performance, and the accuracy. So the sort of damage they would do, say, were they to fire, say, against Charing Cross, could be very readily estimated. It gave us actually, as I put it, a ringside seat at all the trials of the German flying bombs. And every month I could provide the chiefs of staff with a complete rundown of every shot the Germans had fired.
The immediate reaction was to bomb the ramp sites in northern France. The first raid took place as early as December 1943, and during the following months, thousands of tons of bombs were dropped on the launching sites. The colonel of the regiment which was being trained to operate those sites was Max Wachtel.
Natürlich waren die Verwüstungen enorm durch die Bombardierung. Es waren ja morgens griffen die Engländer an, mittags die Amerikaner und abends Amerikaner und Engländer, sodass von den Stellungen überhaupt nichts übrig blieb als eine Wüstenei. Damit konnte man gar nichts mehr anfangen.
The intensive bombing of the launching sites led to a delay of several vital months in the start of the flying bomb offensive. The development of the V-2 rocket had also suffered from the bombing of Peenemunde in August. The Germans, fearing another attack, decided to move most experimental testing of the rocket away from Germany. The site chosen was further east in Poland. About 150 miles south of Warsaw, the small village of Blizna housed an SS training camp. Deep in the forest, the site provided a natural security screen. But it was here that the German scientists ran into another snag, which was to hold up operational success for almost a year. Many of the rockets took off successfully, but on nearing their target, 200 miles away, most of them broke up in mid-air. The target area was near the River Bug in East Poland, and a special detachment of troops was stationed there. Their task was to recover the pieces of the fallen rockets for analysis by German scientists. The main disadvantage of this new location was that the local civilian population was less than enthusiastic about German secret weapons falling on them from out of the sky. They'd been asked by the Polish resistance movement to try to collect the wreckage before the Germans got to it. In May 1944, a rocket crashed into the banks of the River Boob. The ground here is marshy, and the rocket was relatively intact. The local villagers covered it with reeds and called in a resistance leader, Lieutenant Jakubski. It was here that the rocket landed without exploding. The Germans failed to find it, and after a few days they stopped looking altogether. The partisans then pulled the rocket up to the bank, and a team of experts came from Warsaw to dismantle it. The parts were loaded into sacks, but the problem was getting them to Warsaw. They did it by hiding the sacks under loads of vegetables. These were then carted to Warsaw along the little-used country roads. Just in case any German patrol became too inquisitive, the cart was shadowed by armed partisans hidden in the woods. In Warsaw, the risk of discovery was even greater. There were constant security checks everywhere. But the parts were successfully smuggled into the city, and Polish scientists were briefed to work on them. One of them was a physicist, Professor Groskowski. He was to study the electronic parts of the rocket. But his laboratory at the university would be one of the first places the Gestapo would search. So the resistance decided that a private flat would be better, the flat of an unsuspecting German officer. The electronic units were hidden by night in one of the officer's own suitcases.
Before my visit, this case has been taken from the room of the officers and in the special room for me prepared to make investigation.
Groskowski worked for hours at a time in the small room, with the constant danger of the officer returning unexpectedly.
No, never happened during my stay there. He was all the time was absent in the flat, because it was so that the servant asked him by telephone what he wished to have for the dinner, you know, and that was necessary to make sure that he was at the time in his office in the airport, German airport. But if he said, for instance, that he's ready to come earlier, so I would be prevented and disappeared.
After several days of this initial study, the parts were flown out of Poland late one night by an RAF Dakota. Meanwhile, another lucky accident had occurred hundreds of miles away. One of the last of the rockets launched from Peenemunde had crashed in southern Sweden. The British exchanged radar equipment for the wreckage, and after inspecting it at Farnborough, were able to work out such crucial details as the size of the warhead, the fuel used, and the speed of flight. But by the summer of '44, it looked as though other events were about to overtake the V-weapon threat.
This is London. London calling in the home, overseas and European services of the BBC, under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
The 6th of June 1944, D-Day, and no V-weapons had yet been launched against Britain. There was a very real possibility of the Allies overrunning the flying bomb sites before they could be used. Hitler ordered an immediate acceleration of the whole project. The Germans had developed a new kind of prefabricated site, which could be assembled just before launching, and so it was very difficult to pick up on aerial photographs. The firing ramps were hastily completed, and just 1 week after D-Day, the flying bomb offensive began. At first, the British anti-aircraft guns could do very little. The bombs were too low for the big guns to be used effectively, and at the same time, they were fast and difficult targets for the light guns. make matters worse, too many of the guns were sited in London itself.
The guns weren't all that effective, and indeed over the first 2 or 3 days they were a menace, because here they were in London, and there would be a flying bomb. If a flying bomb got as far as London, the one thing to do was to pray it went on and not try and shoot it down, because the warhead would probably come down anyway.
The ton of explosive in the warhead could do enormous damage, and over the first few days the death toll rose steadily. On the morning of Sunday the 18th of June, in the middle of a service, the chapel in Wellington Barracks received a direct hit. Almost 200 people were killed or injured. At that time, Dr. Jones happened to be in his office close by.
I went out through Queen Anne's Gate into Birdcage Walk, and well, one of those sights one doesn't forget, because the blast of those bombs was terrific, bursting as they did above ground, and the whole of Birdcage Walk was just one sea of plane tree leaves. You know, all the leaves had been stripped off the trees, and of course they were nicely freshly green. It was one complete green sea, Wellington Barracks and so forth. And I went as far as the chapel, saw the corner of the chapel had been hit. And well, by the time I got there, you know, the guards were beginning to carry out their dead, and they'd obviously got everything under control. So I went back to the office. But the effect of a bomb so near Whitehall undoubtedly accelerated the interest and the demand in Whitehall circles for a more intense forms of countermeasures. That particular bomb, I think, had quite a lot of effect, more than it ought to have done, really, because after all, the bomb that happens to be near you shouldn't affect you all that much. But there's a sort of inverse square law in all this. Of course, that the ones that get near you really bring it home. And it brought it home to me in a way. I mean, I knew what a ton of explosive would do, and I'd been looking forward to this in a way for months. But to have, you know, really when you go out and see that effect, and you see the, you know, I wouldn't say men you know quite, but men you know of being carried out dead and so forth, undoubtedly you can't avoid the effect being quite strong.
Shortly afterwards, Duncan Sands was asked to take charge of the organisation of countermeasures.
General Pyle, Air Marshal Hill and I came to the conclusion that we'd do an awful lot better if we were to move the guns down to the coast and give them prime responsibility for the defence.
This decision to move the guns was made without putting it to the Chiefs of Staff in order to speed up the whole process.
The Chiefs of Staff were naturally furious. London was inevitably left undefended for about 48 hours while the guns were on the move, and there were quite high casualties. But very quickly, the anti-aircraft guns with their new radio proximity fuses fully justified the decision.
Base control!
The use of proximity fuses, which detonated the shell when it was close to the target aircraft, greatly increased the chances of a kill. The second defensive breakthrough was the new American radar equipment, which assisted gunners to aim at these difficult, fast-flying targets. Another major defence, of course, was the Royal Air Force. The new Meteor jets were fast enough to catch the flying bomb in level flight, but there were not many of them in service, and only a few of the piston-engine aircraft had sufficient speed. Firing at a ton of explosive required some nerve. The results could be very interesting, not to say downright dangerous.
Another method, which was come across by accident, was
tipping the V1 over by the wingtip of the fighter. And this happened in my own case when I'd used up my ammunition on one V1, saw another one, and decided to try and do something about it. And the method was to get your wingtip close underneath the wingtip of the V1, but not touching it, and then gradually raise your own wing to raise the airflow over it to affect the gyro stabilization of the V1. So you lifted your wingtip under the wingtip of the V1 and toppled it over, and it went in and crashed.
If the bombs survived both the RAF and the anti-aircraft guns, they still had to get through the barrage balloons, and only a very small percentage of them did.
To give you a final figure, it was well over 90% of the bombs were caught before they got to London, which really was a very impressive performance indeed. If the Germans had just done one thing, if they'd put a jinker in so that the bomb flew in a zigzag instead of straight, of course, the predictors couldn't have coped with it.
Those bombs that did get through were entirely random in their effect, because the exact point at which they would fall was always unpredictable. But the German commander of the offensive needed to know whether they were roughly on target. For this, he had to rely upon reports from German agents in Britain. Dr. Jones decided to make use of this channel of communication.
We were feeding back to him the information from what the German intelligence authorities assumed was a network of their agents who were in fact very securely locked up by MI5, and we not merely used the fact they were kept locked up to make them ineffective, you see, but we turned them round and in fact had arranged from time to time to provide various false clues which would make the Germans think we were doing one thing when we were doing another.
One device used was to record the time of bombs that fell in southeast London, but report through the controlled German agents that these bombs had fallen in northwest London, hoping thereby that the launching crews would believe that they were overshooting and reduce the range.
And we went on with the deception, and, well, at the very minimum, 1,000 men or women were alive at the end of the war who would not have been alive, and one could show this by an analysis quite simply.
By early September 44, the attacks were gradually decreasing as the launching sites were captured by the advancing Allies. But even with the capture of the flying bomb sites, the Germans had one last card to play. They had at last perfected the V2 rocket. On the evening of September the 8th, 1944, a rocket took off from the Dutch coast. A few minutes later, it landed in West London. By this time, British scientific intelligence knew a good deal about the rocket. It had become obvious that there was absolutely no defence against it once it had been fired. It was equally impossible to bomb the launching sites because they were mobile. The rocket was set up on a small metal platform, and an armoured vehicle was used to control the launch.
Hauptstufe! Hauptstufe gegeben!
A few hours after launching, the site could be cleared. To make it even more difficult, the Germans often used a location in the middle of a residential suburb in The Hague. As a first line of attack, Allied aircraft were used to strafe the rockets and their supporting equipment as they were being moved across Europe.
The principal job of number 602 Squadron with our Spitfire 16s was to make life as difficult as possible for the V2 operators. We were withdrawn from Antwerp to Coltishall in Norfolk, and our parish was the whole of the coastal strip of Holland from the Hook to Den Helder. We dive-bombed and skip-bombed and strafed railways, roads, bridges, anything that moved. And we also attacked suspected launching sites, which were reported to us by the Dutch resistance workers. And on one occasion, I remember, my logbook tells me it was February the 14th, I led such an attack. We dive-bombed. We carried 1,000 pounds of bombs on our Spit 16s, a wood just north of The Hague. And I think I must have been feeling particularly aggressive because, again, I see from my logbook that after delivering the attack, we turned back in to engage the anti-aircraft gunners that had been shooting at us. So as we returned to this target, which we had just attacked, there came up from the center of this wood, right before our eyes, the unmistakable shape of a V2 which had just been launched. Now, of course, no one had ever seen one until that time, or certainly none of my little lot. I couldn't do very much about it because I was having a rather unpleasant argument with these gentlemen on the ground. But my number 4, a little Scotsman called Cupid Love, who was away out and low to my right, actually fired at this V2 in flight as it went up straight through the ring of his gun sight. I think this must have been the most optimistic shot of the entire war. I think it's perhaps as well that he didn't blow it up, otherwise it would have been very embarrassing for the rest of us. And I also think that this was almost certainly the first and probably the only occasion in which an airborne rocket missile was actually engaged by a conventional aircraft.
It wasn't until March 1945 that the Allied advance across Europe finally pushed the rockets out of range of Britain. But by then, the V weapons had killed almost 9,000 people and injured 24,000. They had indeed caused some terror. At the height of the V1 offensive, it's estimated that apart from those officially evacuated, over 1 million people fled from London. In strictly military terms, the V weapons were so inaccurate that they were almost useless. What is more, as far as the Germans were concerned, they tied up scientists and other resources which could well have been used on more important tasks. It is at least arguable that Hitler's terror weapons accelerated Germany's defeat.